I have this problem, getting on trains. You wait for the carriage to stop moving, and there's that red flashing light on the door with a panel that reads, "To open, press when illuminated." And it seems presumptuous to assume that I am in any way transcendent. But at the same time, I want to go wherever it is I've booked the journey for. So I muscle my way onto the train, thinking that, as well as checking my ticket, an inspector is going to assess the degree to which I've achieved illumination. Naturally, I have Robert Anton Wilson to thank for this public transport quandary. I came across the Illuminatus trilogy when I was 17, and it would be fair to say that those books changed my life. Or at the very least, got me jumpy about the number 23 in ways that worried my friends. When I was a student, it was Wilson that made it difficult for me to take a politics degree as seriously as I was being asked to. And it was Wilson I quit a job in Florida to see in 1987 when he was doing a talk in Tallahassee. I went to check him out, having met some Odinists in Ohio who knew his schedule, Norse pagans being pretty well informed. And I stayed in Tallahassee a few days with some occultists who also attended the talk. We'd got chatting over a meal that worked out at $5.23 per head when we split the bill, and they welcomed me to their home and introduced me to their organisation. WOC, it was called, the initials WSC, standing for whatever members like the sound of. We Order Chaos was one presumptuous choice. It's cow backwards, too. They were an inspirational bunch. Quite a few of them were artists, and the wealthier ones put money into a fund that supported the less well-off to get through college. They in turn paid that investment off by working on a plot of land WOC owned in some woods, where they were building a structure to hang out in. The land adjacent to theirs belonged to William Burroughs, the beat author whose tabloid headline is that he accidentally shot his first wife. I was introduced to his third wife, a tree on the land that he owned. Less chance of controversy if he shot her, and there's a long history of this sort of thing in shamanic traditions. She seemed nice, if quiet. All of this was a huge inspiration to me, and vibrant proof that people could manage their lives successfully in ways that owe little to mainstream ideas of how to do stuff. That stayed with me, and it's something I hold on to. Something I learnt from theatre legend Ken Campbell was that you can commission yourself to do things. It was the gist of one of the stories he told about a German artist who moved from Munich to another part of the country where he wasn't known. The artist found himself interviewed by police when they apprehended him halfway up someone's driveway in the small hours. There were artistic reasons for this, and it was only when the artist told the police and a psychiatrist he had a commission that they let him go. That story inspired me to commission myself to interview Ken in the early 90s, and we spent a glorious afternoon in Walthamstow Marshes. This time I've commissioned myself to do a talk. Consider this talk an incantation then, a celebration of things that shouldn't be. It's positive in many ways, and one of the things I'm positive about is that there are worrying undercurrents to the ongoing trend for people with a public platform to be speaking on behalf of a particular form of rationalist fundamentalism. Pin your lugholes back, because this is where the good stuff starts. Here goes.
Richard Dawkins takes the stage in a suit, white as incisors, most puritanical of the new reformed atheists, and testifies against belief with Jesuit rigour.
Eddie Izzard supports him on backing vocals, polish highlighting nails Coca-Cola red, like the ones keeping Christ in place on a porcelain crucifix in a Golgotha diorama purchased by Charles Saatchi, patron saint of high-ticket iconic irony. Even Paul Daniels is there, debunking anything anyone may have mistakenly thought was magical, though it disappoints the people holding up for that nice Brian Cox. He's opted instead to edutain Radio 6 breakfast show listeners in danger of making the complementary medicine mistake. Tim Minchin provides piano accompaniment and strictly secular dreadlocks, looking like the child Mick Hucknall had while so coked up he fucked himself. And none of it, not one word, is useful for holding back the fears when they leave the green room after the show. Still they face night terrors as dark and strong as when Homo sapiens lived in caves, wonder if they will see the sun again and whether they will enter that place in the pantheon reserved for sceptics and rationalists. Really, though, why are they so concerned that some of us may have experiences that we don't interpret correctly, that our conclusions may lead us awry into outbreaks of unsanctioned gnosis, promiscuous heterodoxy, even a dabble with corn? I'm familiar with the latter since a goblin told me I was vegetarian last year as I stood in Sainsbury's about to put a packet of bacon in my basket. His name was Vern. and for a month I'd been writing intensely about his adventures for a fantasy adventure serial I'd been commissioned to script. In the story, Vern was getting messages from voices in his head that guided him to his destiny, so when Vern popped up in my own noggin, I took him at his word. Over the next 4 months I'd lost about £35, a shift that had eluded me when I dabbled with Weight Watchers and other rational ways to shed pounds. That goblin stopped me gobbling, and I reserved the right to think of him as that. Is anyone stopping me from having these adventures in my private world? Put it this way, I've been cautious who I share such exploits with, just as I am wary of opening up about some of the synchronicities that shape my life, and which give existence the feel of a poem or a cryptic joke rather than an equation. Beautiful as equations can be, many of those who cherish them are inclined to treat them as descriptions of reality. I'm more inclined to think of any description, however rigorous, as a placeholder that serves a useful function for some people some of the time. In case you're thinking that's a naive viewpoint, consider this. The speed of light is a constant, meaning it never changes. Except when it does. Between 1928 and 1945, variations were consistently recorded below the supposed constant, leading some to conclude that light speed is cyclic and not fixed. It's now harder to determine the truth. The speed of light is measured in metres, and metres are calibrated by the speed of light. So if there is any variation, we're none the wiser, as each is defined by the other. It's kind of like defining Roger Moore as the actor who played James Bond after Sean Connery, and Sean Connery as 007 before Roger Moore. As more atheists take the stage and preach, I'm inclined to suggest that not all of us are inclined to share their binary worldview. I get the thing about fundamentalism, but I can't help being reminded of something. First, they came for the creationists. Please don't mistake any of this for an anti-science stance. I don't need to tell anyone that science can achieve incredible results, as a consequence of which at this point in history people are living longer than before, with many diseases a thing of the past and Netflix on tap. We get it, thanks. Science is a form of human behaviour, and I've yet to come across any form of human behaviour that isn't prone to partiality, boundary drawing and intolerance of some kind or another. We're kidded into thinking otherwise, in part because of the way that science is taught at schools. The way you're told to write about experiments removes the people doing them from the activities that they get up to. The apparatus was set up as shown in the diagram. Who set it up? At my school, it was either us, the students, or a technician called Wolfman, depending how hazardous the lesson was likely to be. And who conducted the experiments? Again, it was us, or the chemistry teacher, and we were conducting our own experiments on him. Mr. Bradshaw was exposed to derision from the class for 11 minutes. Reddening of the face was observed, and an increase in volume of voice and spittle noted, followed in the 12th minute by detentions being given to 5 of the researchers for insolence. Though you can write about experiments in such a way that you delete any subjectivity, it's a pretence. There are different kinds of partiality, starting with how we feel when we wake up. Some of the scientists I've known are big drinkers, and that affected what they did and how they did it when they went into the lab with a hangover. And wearing a white coat doesn't stop me being as sexist, racist, homophobic or otherwise partial as anyone else. The far extreme of such thinking takes the form of eugenics, which was mainstream science from around 1870 to 1950. Eugenics started with Darwin's cousin Francis Galton, who described his intent as the science of improving stock, not only by judicious mating, but whatever tends to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. Sure, eugenics was challenged and overturned thanks to the poor publicity it got from what the Nazis did to give Aryans a leg up. And that begs the question of just what that we see as acceptable now will be viewed as wrong-headed in a decade, which isn't as straightforward as it sounds. The way it's described, scientists just check out the latest research and miraculously segue from the outmoded belief to the shiny new one without any grumbling or nostalgia. Many people, scientists or not, get grouchy when the toilet paper is changed without them knowing. Are you honestly telling me they're okay with someone redefining reality while their backs are turned? Einstein wasn't, famously refusing to accept the implications of quantum physics because, quote, God does not play dice with the world. He'd twisted his own melon coming up with the theory of relativity, and his synapses were still raw and ragged from the exertion. Einstein couldn't deal with the idea that there was a beyond, even beyond the beyond he'd mapped. which is reasonable enough. It's like asking someone to move house when they've settled into what they thought was their permanent residence, complete with definitive toilet paper. We are human, and that means we have a point of view, one that will not always match what others say. Back in the 19th century, there was a point when hypnosis was used to prepare patients for surgery. One of the big names in the field was John Elliotson, who opened the London Mesmeric Infirmary in 1849 and performed operations including amputations. He'd also got people like James Esdale, who did 300 major and 100 minor operations using hypnosis. Around the same time, nitrous oxide was gaining popularity. A learned committee looked into hypnosis and declared it bogus, saying that patients were just pretending not to feel pain when they had their limbs hacked off. It later transpired that these statements were falsified, but by then it was too late for hypnosis. The nitrous oxide advocates didn't even have to take the doctors to a conference in a tropical climate with great golfing facilities, which is how such things are done these days. Part of the reason they do so is to distract delegates from the poor quality of the research being done to cook up profitable new avenues. Doctors have more than enough to concern themselves without scrutinising the detailed evidence underpinning products they're asked to buy. They rely on capsule summaries from sales reps and comments from peers, derived from the same marketing materials everyone at the conference is presented with. The active engagement of doctors with science is replaced by a faith in it, pretty much indistinguishable from the faith that they'll score a hole-in-one out on that golf course. A series of articles in The Lancet in 2010 noted that 85% of the world's spending on medical research, around $200 billion, was wasted on studies that were poorly designed, redundant, unpublished, or unreported. Even for that work which is published, Stanford epidemiologist John Ioannidis says much of it is fundamentally flawed, mostly because of faulty statistics. The title of his 2005 paper on this is Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. Needless to say, this kind of naysaying doesn't go down very well. Tell someone they're doing things the wrong way, and don't be surprised when they get upset. In the 19th century, Ignaz Semmelweis was insistent that clean hands would reduce mortality rates in surgery, but doctors were offended that he was telling them to wash. He proved that mortality could be reduced to less than 1% if surgeons used disinfectant, but they didn't want to know. Semmelweis was committed to an asylum in 1865 and beaten to death by guards a fortnight later. Only when Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister championed his research did Semmelweis's ideas become mainstream. So, you'll understand why I'm cautious who I tell about goblins talking to me. And it's not like I believe that it really was a goblin. It was just the form that an intuition took, using a framework that had relevance for me and which I'd pay attention to. That's all. And as for going into a casino for the first time in my life, and a voice in my head telling me what number was coming up on roulette and that being right, well, I had a 1 in 37 chance anyway, and just how many times did I ignore a voice that told me something wrong? What about another time, though? I was chatting to a friend who writes comedy, and he was outlining a way of putting a sketch together. He needed 2 characters to demonstrate what he's on about, and the first rolled off his tongue, a retired Mountie. For the other, he paused, and time seemed to slow down as he searched for another character. And in the centre of my head, where I'd never heard a voice before, I heard the phrase, alcoholic ballet dancer, which were the next words my friend said as time returned to its normal flow and reality resumed. This wasn't an anecdote I'd heard before, and my friend didn't have an undue fascination with either Mounties or ballet dancers. So what had happened? Had I caught a glimpse of the future, been beamed what he was about to say? Or somehow tuned into his thought processes? Maybe I had telepathically influenced him to talk about boozed-up leotard wearers. And how had I forgotten about all the times when I thought about alcoholic ballet dancers without a friend talking about them immediately after? In stories, this sort of thing lends itself to science fiction, superheroes and horror. I kept my mouth shut, at least around the friend this had happened with, who registers high on the rationalist scale. I met a client for the first time about some copywriting work they wanted done. We'd been chatting for a while just fine, and all of a sudden I had a picture of the actor Steve McQueen in my head. Steve McQueen is not someone I think about very often, and especially not in business meetings where it's all I can do to keep a straight face some of the time. But there he was, and I paid no attention, until a few minutes later when the client showed me some previous work they'd done, a campaign that I'd never seen before, which used images of Steve McQueen. You have to be careful with this kind of stuff, not least about who you share it with. People have some pretty fixed notions of sanity, and upsetting them doesn't go down very well. The magazine Frontiers in Psychology, Personality Science and Individual Differences recently rejected a paper called Recursive Fury, Conspiracist Ideation in the Blogosphere in Response to Research on Conspiracist Ideation. It's tied up with how conspiracy theorists respond to people researching them, which sounds entertaining. But the core of the paper seriously suggests that people who deny what scientific orthodoxy says are insane. The context they're talking about is climate change, but the principle is more general. It's okay, though. The paper was rejected for publication for fear of lawsuits from climate change skeptics. What about climate change skeptics who are scientists? There's no shortage. Are they crazy? Or is it acceptable to have a different paradigm when you're trained to do so and can adjust it when your current model needs updating? What if you have the right viewpoint before it becomes acceptable? People who complain about fluoride in the water have been characterised as nutters for years. Turns out that some of them, at least, were just prematurely correct. The Lancet, the world's oldest peer-reviewed medical journal, contains a report in its March issue that fluoride should be classified as a neurotoxin with potential developmental effects. So were people campaigning about fluoride beforehand right because the Lancet agrees with them, or crazy because they hadn't conducted research in the approved manner, which we now know would have probably been wrong anyway? And what about people who've been using natural remedies before pharmaceutical companies got hold of the plants that they're found in and turned them into patented products? It's a good thing that we can all agree on what crazy is. Very simply, it's whatever gets into the pages of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, produced by the American Psychiatric Association. Admittedly, they have previously declared that homosexuality is a mental illness, but they did change their minds in 1974. Back in 1850, Samuel Cartwright discovered a new disease that he called drapetomania, from the Greek drapetes, meaning runaway slave. Drapetomania was, said Cartwright, the disease causing Negroes to run away, the chief symptom of which was absconding from service. You can't separate a diagnosis from the person making it and the culture they are part of, and diagnoses stick. In 1972, a number of young people turned up to hospitals reporting that they heard a voice saying "thud." Each and every one of them was admitted to hospital with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, though in all other respects they behaved normally. They were students participating in an experiment by sociologist David Rosenhan, and hospital staff took some convincing to let them out again. Whatever the students did was viewed as being symptomatic of their supposed condition, so when they dutifully wrote down what was happening around them, staff in turn wrote down that the patients exhibited note-taking behaviour. All of them were let out and recorded as experiencing schizophrenia with remission. How does the American Psychiatric Institution decide what to put into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual? They have a panel which discusses proposals. Here's Renee Garfinkel, who sat on DSM advisory committees. There was a discussion about whether a particular behaviour should be classed as a symptom of a particular disorder. To my great astonishment, one task force member suddenly piped up, "Oh no, we can't include that behaviour as a symptom because I do that." And so it was decided that that behaviour would not be included because, presumably, if someone on the task force does it, it must be perfectly normal. Think of the DSM's methodology less as a robust vetting procedure than a version of X Factor in which weirdness gets voted on by the judges, who by definition aren't weird at all. Anything I say on this subject can be taken with a pinch of salt, since I'm no stranger to mental institutions myself. I've twice been sectioned, each time for 3 weeks. Second time was the one that did the trick of persuading me not to go back. Entering a mental ward on the 6th of the 6th, 2006 will do that for you, especially when one of the first people you talk to is called Damien. Damien and I made games of Ludo last as long as we could to pass the time. It was Damien that told me the old woman who ate only sandwiches was responsible for keeping alive the babies in the hospital's incubators. Some people played special roles in the place, in Damien's thinking. Not sure mine was, but he told me to stop reading the novel that I was attempting to occupy myself with because the words were too loud in his head. Did that actually happen for him, or did he just imagine it did? I know that on the first occasion I was sectioned, A couple of years before that, I had what seemed very much like an experience of momentarily being in the mind of each of the patients in the room we were gathered, standing in a circle and laughing uproariously, consciousness zipping around from one to another and my viewpoint shifting as it did. It seems to me that was something real and shared, a glimpse we all had of the connectedness of all things and the hilarity that prompted when we realised how truly ridiculous we all were. Musician Robert Fripp speaks of a similar experience when he was playing a gig and suddenly found himself looking out from the eyes of his drummer. Fripp hasn't been sectioned, and in case you're assuming he's a rock and roll drug casualty, as if that would explain his experience, he's a non-user. It's common for people to dismiss talk of psychic occurrences as if science has put them on the naughty step and found them wanting. Science does no such thing. There are scientists, and some of them are prone to one viewpoint, some to another, others to neither. All I can tell you is what I know to be true in my own experience and what that leads me to suspect. And I can refer you to research which you might not have come across, not to mention a wealth of anecdotal information, such as that collated by Elizabeth Mayer in her book Extraordinary Knowing. Psychologist Mayer had her world turned upside down when someone located a missing musical instrument through dowsing, identifying the specific address where it could be found when conventional means of investigation had failed. The dowser lived nowhere near the area it had happened, which reduces the chances of them having inside knowledge, as do other details of the case. I don't need convincing that information can be accessed in places where a person isn't. Be where the difference is. Sometimes that means shifting where you are to experience novelty, or stay where you are and it will find you. In 1984, I began a politics degree at Sheffield University, where the orthodox left of the time took a joyless Puritan form. Alexis Sale captured it when he said they were the ones in the audience who considered the implications of a comedian's every syllable before conceding a smile. Distanced from most of the people I was supposed to like, I discovered colour and life with the green anarchist scene, which opened up other directions. A few of us started a pagan group, and suddenly we were pagans, sort of. Knowing that there were others about, we set a day to meet them, and they gathered in Sheffield for our pagan moot. All of us sat in a circle, so when someone entered it and sat outside, we didn't know how to take it. Had he intentionally harshed our mellow? The interloper wore a warrior of the wasteland-style leather coat and had an enormous occult symbol round his neck. His name was Rodney Orpheus, and he was the singer in a Leeds goth band called the Cassandra Complex. He was also a key player in an even shadier Leeds scene, Chaos Magic, the postmodern punky reimagining of the classical occultism explored by Victorian poets and dandies like Yeats. With him, looking like a mafia defence lawyer in his pinstripe suit with shades and ponytail, was Phil Hine, who wrote extensively on Chaos Magic and is cited as one of its key figures, another seemingly heavy character. It didn't strike me at the time that Rodney being in a band with Cassandra in the name was maybe paying tribute to Only Fools and Horses, in which Rodney Trotter has strong feelings for a woman called Cassandra. He didn't think to mention stuff like that to the Leeds 6 occult scene bother boys, who were cut of sterner stuff than us in Sheffield. Over time I saw other sides to them and that world, but I'm talking first impressions. There was someone else with them, cut from a different cloth, a 6'4" Scouser with long orange hair, dungarees, John Lennon glasses and painted Dr. Martens. Beaming, he introduced himself as Rona the Lovely. He looked more like a hippified kids' TV presenter than a sinister sorcerer. Rona went on to become a friend and mentor, and I spent quite a bit of time with him in Wakefield over the next 15 years. He called himself a trainer, and his trainees were younger people, many looking for something in life after they hadn't been lucky enough to reach escape velocity from school. I got to know many of them over time, and though I was never a trainee myself, you couldn't help pick things up from Rona. There was something undeniably cultish about it all, but in an endearingly daft way, and it worked. One night, one of the trainees was stuck out in a severe blizzard that had blown up at a garage miles away where she was working. Within minutes, they'd arranged to borrow a four-wheel drive vehicle to get out there and pick her up, complete with blankets to wrap her in and flask of soup. Another, trained as a car mechanic, joined the Territorial Army and worked as a stripper before getting security work at the British Embassy in Paris, where she was joined by another trainee who got a job as a nanny and dated the Latvian ambassador. She's now working as a psychotherapist. Not bad for a girl who left school in a defunct Yorkshire town with next to no qualifications and no sense of what to do with her life. What Rona did above anything else was to inspire people, and he'd stop at nothing to do so. He hammed up his magical interests, described his home as the Vicarage, and to get trainees interested in science made up the Psychic Studies Institute with its own headed notepaper. Ridiculous at one level, but more effective than the schools they'd been to at getting them engaged. Trainees used the notepaper to write to professors at universities who responded to them several steps up from the method, results, conclusion dreariness in which the apparatus was set up as shown in the diagram. And this is where it all falls apart. Dawkins and others taking the stage are speaking up because they believe it's important in a world where religious fundamentalists are killing girls rather than allow them to receive education, where evangelists target abortionists for death because of their belief in the sanctity of life, where people would rather believe that sinister conspiracies control the world than empower themselves to create their own choices. And I share those beliefs. So to that extent I agree with Dawkins, because there's something in him and those who speak alongside him that resonates with me. And there are areas where we differ. The same goes across the board. There are those we agree with, those we like to castigate, because innate to us as humans is our ability to other people, to make them something less than us and presumably to make us greater. Robert Anton Wilson often spoke of how we are living on the planet of the apes, and a lot of the time it's easy to see what he was getting at. When Tim Burton was making his version of Planet of the Apes, there were actors in chimpanzee gear, actors in gorilla gear, and actors dressed as orangutans. When it was lunchtime on set, all the actors gathered with ones made up to be the same kind of apes that they were portraying. Ronan the Lovely talked about how, back in the day, people approached Buddha and asked him about all sorts of stuff, like what sort of robe to wear. He reckoned they should wear a saffron robe, which was like the jeans and t-shirt of the day. As for hair, just do it in a simple knot, rather than doing anything fancy denoting status. And as for language, speak Pali, the language of the people, rather than use Sanskrit, which was a poetic script where one word could have several meanings. Centuries later, devotees wear saffron robes as they clatter down Oxford Street, chanting words that mean nothing to passers-by, and certainly don't look as if they're ordinary humans speaking the language of the people. Think about it, though. If you meet someone who speaks like a regular person, looks like one, and acts like one, then maybe, just maybe, they're the Buddha. And if we look for that in the people we come across, maybe we'll see they're illuminated, and that we all are, in some sense, some of the time, in ways that will differ for us all from moment to moment. It might not be true, but I tend to feel on shaky ground making pronouncements about truth. I do know that it's worth supposing, and that supposing opens doors a lot easier than belief. If we're among transcendent beings, who knows what gods we'll meet in our day-to-deity existence? Looking around me, I see a man who could be Jesus, a woman with Eris shining inside her, and there, I can't believe it's not Buddha. You don't need anyone else's approval. Just suppose you're illuminated. At the very least, it'll make your train journeys easier in the future. Thank you.